osteoporosis pre, osteoporosis or osteopenia, and bone loss myths. Now, what I want you to understand about it being a myth is this. 1994 is when the definition of osteoporosis changed. Before 1994, osteoporosis was really considered a disease of the elderly. So people would get so old that they might have fractures, but it was really arguably a very rare disease. Not a lot of people had it, not a lot of people even really knew about it. But in 1994, something interesting happened. We got this machine invented called a bone mineral density scan. Some people refer to it as a DEXA machine. So if you've had that X-ray, dual X-ray absorptiometry machine, if you've had that done, you know, they measured the density of how much X-ray was able to penetrate through your bone in your spine, right, in your lumbar spine. They measure in the hips, and sometimes they measure in the heel, in the calcaneal bone. So this happened in 1994, and it reclassified the definition of osteoporosis. Now, the problem with these bone mineral density scanners is, number one, the data of what bone should look like is based on young women. Now, a lot of you who get this diagnosis don't realize that you're being basically compared to women who are 35 years of age. And so many of you who are getting these scans are 50, 60, 65 plus. You can't compare a 35-year-old with a 65-year-old. So there's no great data that says that a 35-year-old's bone should be equal to a 65-year-old's bone. I mean, if we look at bone growth and the way it happens is from an early age, we have slow, steady increase in bone growth. And then around the age of 35, it peaks out. And it goes there for a while, and then there's a slow, steady decline in bone as you age. So it's kind of a curve, you know. So again, think of this as early life. Think of this as 35, and then coming over here, you know, 65 plus. So we're going to have a decline in bone when we compare ourselves to a 35-year-old. Many people are going to have this decline. So I want you to, first of all, understand that the whole premise of basing your bone, if you're not 35, on somebody who is 35 is not a fair comparison. And in that regard, it can be very, very misleading. So if you've got a bone density scan that has, and the doctor's told you have osteopenia or osteoporosis, or, you know, a score of 2.5 standard deviations away from the norm, then what they're basically telling you is that your bone doesn't absorb X-ray very well as compared to a 35-year-old female. Now, that doesn't mean you have poor bone density. That doesn't mean that you have unhealthy bone. The bone scan doesn't tell you the quality of the bone that you have. It only tells you how much or what the ability of your bone is to absorb X-rays. That's not bone health. That's bone absorbing X-rays. Again, what makes up bone health? Bone is a structure that in your body regenerates bone. About every 7 years you have a brand new skeleton. And it's kind of like on a teeter-totter. We are breaking bone down. And it's balanced for most people by building new bone. And so if there's this constant breakdown, this constant build-up, what we want it to be balanced out. We don't want to have very, very highly aggressive breakdown of our bone without new bone being created. And so in this regard, that could be a problem, but a DEXA scan is not measuring that. A DEXA scan doesn't tell you how fast you're making new bone versus how fast you're breaking down bone. A DEXA scan measures how much X-ray your bone absorbs compared to how much X-ray a 35-year-old woman's bone absorbs. So it's not, again, it's not a fair comparison, and I want you to understand this because the definition itself is really misleading. To say that you have osteoporosis and call it a disease is extremely misleading, and we'll talk more about that as we get into some of the medicines that are being recommended and the billion-dollar industry that's emerged from calling bone loss or osteoporosis and defining it as less than a 35-year-old's bone. So we want to build new bone roughly as fast as we're breaking bone down, and we want this process to go back and forth. In essence, we don't want to not break bone down, and here's why. When your bone gets old, okay, and it becomes damaged, we want to break down those old damaged cells, those old damaged tissues, and we want to replace it with new tissue, just like when your skin starts to age, it sloughs off and you replace it with new skin, right? Every cell in your body is replicating and making new copies of itself. As it ages, it replaces itself, and we don't want our bone to stop doing that either. So understand that you do break bone down, but you do it for a reason. You're trying to replace it with building in healthy new bone. And if we call this a disease, again, we're going to run into some problems, because one of the issues that we have with bone is, if you get the diagnosis, then one of the first things that happens is you get put on mostly bisphosphonates. Let me spell that right for you. So it's a class of medication that stops this, right? What bisphosphonates do is they, in a sense, stop that from happening. Stop your bone from breaking down. And so it stops you from taking and breaking down old bone and building new bone in its stead, because it's blocking the breakdown of new bone, and it's driving minerals into the bone, and it makes your bone more brittle. If you've ever handled a raw bone, it's pliable, it's strong, and it's pliable, it's bendable, right? It's because it's the backbone of bone, pun intended, right? The backbone, or the architecture inside the bone, is mostly collagen. Collagen's a protein, and then what your body does is, in that protein matrix, it shoves minerals to make it harder, but not to make it brittle so that it snaps. Taking bisphosphonates for long periods of time, we've seen this in a number of studies, it stops the breakdown of bone, and it allows for the mineralization of bone, so it makes the bone harder. So what happens is, these women who take these medications, when they get their DEXA scan, it improves. It improves because the more mineral is in a bone, the more x-rays that bone is going to absorb. And so that woman is thinking, oh, my bone is much more healthy, when in fact her bone is actually much more brittle because of over-mineralization of the bone. So you've got to be very, very cautious about how taking a simple DEXA or bone scan and taking that information and getting on a medicine for the rest of your life because of the fear that you might have a fracture, because that's what it is. Osteoporosis is a completely asymptomatic disorder. You don't know it's a problem until the doctor does the scan and tells you that it's a problem, and then the fear of the fact that it might be a problem is used as a tool to get people to take drugs as a preventative, even though that 63% of fractures occur in people with the highest DEXA scan. So this was a study published from Leeds University. 63% of fractures in this study were more common in people with the highest bone density, not the lowest bone density. So we know the DEXA scan itself is not a very valuable tool at assessing the overall health of bone. Again, I keep saying this, but it is a measure of how well your bone absorbs X-ray. It's not a measure of the nutritional status of your bone, how many nutrients are getting into your bone, whether your vitamin D and your calcium, your magnesium, your boron, your vanadium, your vitamin K, your collagen, or your protein intake, whether all these things are adequate enough to support good bone growth and good bone repair. It's not assessing, a DEXA scan does not assess the architecture of the bone. It doesn't assess the strength of the bone. It's not a functional test. It's simply a test that measures X-ray absorption. So we don't want to necessarily rely on it to make a decision to take a medicine for the rest of our lives that stop the breakdown of bone, stopping this balance between building new bone and breaking down bone appropriately. One of the side effects to these medications, because this is where the real problem comes in, if you're taking these drugs have been shown to cause microfractures. It goes back to what I said before. Microfractures are caused as a result of inhibiting the healthy process of getting rid of old, damaged bone tissue. So when you don't have the ability to get rid of the old, damaged bone tissue, and you're forcing more mineral into the bone using these types of medications, those bones become more brittle. And this is where microfracturing occurs. And we actually learned this because of the field of dentistry. Dentists were noticing that women who were taking these medications were much more substantially likely to develop fractures in their jaw after having procedures done. And that's how that research came to be, is the dentists actually discovered that women on bisphosphonates had greater risk of microfracturing of their jaw when going through dental procedures. Now, there's something else called osteonecrosis that we know these drugs can cause. Osteonecrosis is a fancy way of saying bone death. Osteo meaning bone, necrosis or necrotic meaning death. It's a way to kill your bone. So these bisphosphonates actually have been shown to destroy the bone itself, because when you stop the breakdown of bone tissue, you damage the bone. And we know, so these two are major side effects of what can occur as a result of taking bisphosphonates. But there's another one, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, because many of you watching this show are gluten sensitive, and so you've already struggled with your fair share of gastrointestinal problems. You should know that one of the other side effects of bisphosphonate class of medications is erosion of the intestine and esophagus. So we'll just put GI tract here. So very common to see this as a side effect is the erosion of the esophagus. So it can lead to severe heartburn, severe damage to the esophagus, to the stomach, and to the intestines. So, you know, when you get the diagnosis of osteoporosis, if it's based on a bone scan, and the bone scan is the sole thing that was done to make the decision as to whether your bone is healthy or whether your bone is not healthy, you've been misled, because a DEXA doesn't tell you whether your bone is healthy. A DEXA tells you whether or not your bone is absorbing x-rays as compared to a 35-year-old female. So again, going back to the flaw, or rather to the myth of the diagnosis, didn't even exist. Now, osteoporosis existed before 1994, but the rampant diagnosis of osteoporosis did not. Again, prior to 1994, before we had technology to look at bone density, it was a very rare disease, very rarely discussed, because it wasn't that common and it was asymptomatic, and the only people that really struggled with it were the severe bedridden elderly. And one of the reasons why there were bedridden people that struggled the most with bones and fracture issues is because for bone, there's a law of bone called Wolff's Law, Wolff. And what this means is, in a nutshell, it means use it or lose it, meaning bone grows based on pressure. So if you're not using your bone, if you're in bed, if you're lying down, if you're in an elderly hospital ward, if you are in an elderly home in a wheelchair, sitting on your spine all day but not really exercising, then your bone starts to diminish, because bone grows based on pressure. If you don't have pressure on the bone will start to demineralize and break down, because your body is smart. It recognizes that when you don't use the bone, it's going to break it down and use those resources elsewhere. So the law of bone, or Wolff's Law, use it or lose it, is really the biggest factor in whether or not your bone is going to be healthy or not. Is how much you move, it's how much you exercise, not whether or not you take this type of medication, and not whether or not a bone scan tells you whether or not you're absorbing x-rays in your bone, as well as a 35-year-old female. So understand that your bone works on this premise, and the way we stimulate bone growth is activity, mobility, exercise. Now, one of the things that has happened since 1994 in this regard is that we do have a more sedentary workforce, but that doesn't explain the rampant diagnosing of pre-osteoporosis or osteopenia and osteoporosis. It doesn't explain it at all. What explains it is the poor misuse and misguidance of the DEXA bone scan as a tool to measure and judge the end-all be-all of the health of the bone. It doesn't take into consideration the microstructure of the bone. It doesn't take into consideration the exercise habits of a person. It doesn't take into consideration the nutritional status of an individual. It doesn't take into consideration the flexibility of an individual. It doesn't take into consideration the absorption and resorption of this process and how fast that process is actually happening. It doesn't take anything into consideration except X-ray absorption. And how can we use such a test to give or to dispense a class of medications with so many different dangerous side effects in the name of prevention, right? In the name of prevention. And the fact of the matter is that we shouldn't be. And if you've been told you have osteoporosis and your doctor's not willing to have this conversation with you, I highly encourage that you find a doctor who will have that conversation with you. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.